For nearly 20 years, one member of the Trump family managed to do something almost nobody else in that orbit ever pulled off: stay completely out of the story. No interviews, no campaign speeches, no viral soundbites. And then, in the span of a few weeks, that silence collapsed all at once. A sitting member of Congress wants him questioned under oath. A $10 billion lawsuit is prying open his family's private finances. And his name keeps turning up next to two brothers facing some of the most serious criminal allegations in recent memory. Allegations they both deny. Tonight we're walking through exactly how Barron Trump went from the family's most protected secret to a name showing up in congressional letters and court filings, and why that shift matters far beyond one 20-year-old's Google search history. Let's start with the story that actually broke the silence. In late July of 2026, Representative Yasemin Ansari, a Democrat from Arizona who sits on the House Oversight Committee, sent a formal letter to the committee's Republican chairman, James Comer. Her request was not vague. She asked Comer to open a full investigation into what she described as potential political interference surrounding the criminal cases against Andrew and Tristan Tate, and she specifically asked that Barron Trump be brought in to testify about what he knows. Her letter put it plainly. The committee needed to hear directly from Barron about his knowledge of the Tate brothers' alleged crimes, whether he had any involvement of any kind, and whether he had communicated with anyone in his father's administration or with the president himself about the brothers' legal situation. This wasn't framed as idle curiosity about a young man's online habits. It was framed as a direct question about whether a member of the first family had any role in how the federal government handled two men facing serious charges. Here's where it's important to slow down and separate what's confirmed from what's still just an accusation. Andrew and Tristan Tate, the online personalities who built a massive following through combative hypermasculine content, are facing an extensive list of charges in the United Kingdom, reportedly numbering in the dozens, including allegations of rape, human trafficking, and, according to British reporting, charges tied to indecent images of a child. Both brothers have denied every allegation against them, and it is critical to state clearly that neither man has been convicted of anything. They are still fighting extradition, and these remain accusations, not proven facts. Nothing about their legal status changes because their names happen to now be linked to a presidential family member. So why does Barron's name keep showing up in the same sentence as theirs? According to Ansari's letter and multiple news outlets, there are reports describing extensive communications between Barron and the Tate brothers, tied to the brothers' broader effort to court young male audiences online. Ansari's letter goes further, alleging that these contacts were part of a pattern involving what she called the president's broader political orbit, not Barron alone. It's worth noting that outlets covering the story have been careful to add an important caveat. There is currently no public evidence that Barron communicated with any government official specifically about the Tate brothers' legal troubles, and Newsweek, among others, has explicitly reported that there is no public evidence Barron has been accused of wrongdoing or played any role in decisions involving the case. Ansari's own letter is framed as a request for information, not a verdict. She wants to know whether what she called back-channel communications between the Tate brothers, presidential advisors, and members of the first family shaped how the administration handled the brothers' prosecution or their return to the United States. That's a question, not a conclusion, and the distinction matters enormously here. It also matters that Barron is far from the only name in Trump's orbit connected to this story. Reporting has noted that Vice President J.D. Vance follows both Tate brothers on social media. Donald Trump Jr. publicly criticized the brothers' earlier detention in Romania, calling it absolute insanity. There are also reports that a former publicist and lawyer for the Tate brothers later took on a liaison role at the Department of Homeland Security. And the situation escalated further just recently, when the Tate brothers reportedly traveled to Washington and met with a sitting Republican congressman, a meeting Ansari says she only learned about after journalists asked her about it. Meanwhile, the White House press secretary has stated that the president does not intend to intervene in the extradition process, and the Secretary of State has similarly dismissed any suggestion of interference. Whether any of that adds up to actual political interference is exactly what Ansari's proposed investigation is meant to determine. And right now, that remains an open question rather than an established fact. There's also a practical reality that tempers how seriously we should treat this in the short term. James Comer, the Republican chairman who would need to authorize any real investigation or subpoena, controls what actually moves forward on this committee. And as of the most recent reporting, there's no public indication he intends to act on a request from a Democratic colleague targeting the sitting president's own son. Some coverage has noted that Ansari herself appears to understand this dynamic, framing her push as something that could gain real force only if Democrats gain control of the House after November's midterm elections. So right now, what we're looking at is a formal on-the-record request sitting on a chairman's desk, not an active subpoena, and definitely not a summons headed to Barron's mailbox. While that story was still unfolding, a second, completely separate legal battle was quietly working its way through a federal courtroom in Florida. One that doesn't mention Barron by name, but says a lot about the kind of scrutiny his entire family is currently facing. Back in December of 2025, Donald Trump filed a $10 billion lawsuit against the BBC, accusing the network of misleadingly editing a documentary about his speech on January 6, 2021, in a way that made it sound like he had directly called on supporters to storm the Capitol, while reportedly cutting the portion where he called for peaceful protest. The fallout for the BBC was significant. Reports indicate the network's director general and its head of news both resigned, and the broadcaster issued an apology, acknowledging the edit created what it called a mistaken impression, while still refusing to pay damages and vowing to fight the lawsuit in court. Then came a twist that reportedly caught Trump's legal team off guard, because the lawsuit claims both financial and reputational damages. BBC lawyers argued they were entitled to examine the actual numbers behind those claims. In late July of 2026, a federal magistrate judge, Angelique Lett, agreed, ordering the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust, the entity managing hundreds of Trump-connected businesses, to hand over financial records dating back to January of 2023. The judge reportedly wrote that because Trump's brand, properties, and businesses were all central to his damages claim, that financial information was directly relevant to the case. Trump's legal team had reportedly tried to narrow the case to reputational harm only, specifically to avoid this kind of financial disclosure, and that effort didn't succeed, at least not at first. But this story didn't stop there, and it's worth updating past where a lot of earlier coverage left off. In early August of 2026, just days before the trust was set to comply with that order, Trump's legal team filed an emergency motion asking a different judge, U.S. District Judge Roy Altman, to pause the ruling. Altman granted a temporary stay, meaning the financial records have not yet been handed over, at least for now, while Trump continues arguing in court that the disclosure shouldn't happen at all. That pause isn't permanent, and the underlying fight over whether the BBC gets access to detailed financial and ownership records covering roughly 400 business entities is still very much alive. Separately, the presiding judge has already set a provisional trial date in mid-February of 2027, meaning this case is expected to play out publicly for months to come, regardless of how the financial records dispute is ultimately resolved. Put those two threads together: a congressional letter asking pointed questions about a son's communications, and a federal lawsuit fighting over access to a family trust's finances, and you get a family that has spent years successfully keeping its internal workings private, now facing pressure from two completely different directions at once. And Barron, historically the most protected member of that family, is standing directly in the middle of one of them. Which raises an obvious question: how did the kid nobody used to talk about end up here in the first place? To understand how unusual this moment really is, you have to go back to the beginning. Barron Trump was born in New York City in March of 2006, the only child of Donald and Melania Trump, and by nearly every account, the one Trump child who was deliberately shielded from public attention throughout his upbringing. While his older half-siblings built public profiles, appeared at campaign events, and gave interviews, Melania reportedly kept Barron almost entirely out of the press for most of his childhood. One of the rare exceptions came early in the pandemic, when he was diagnosed with COVID-19 alongside his parents. Otherwise, by most accounts, he grew up moving between Trump Tower and Mar-a-Lago, attended a private academy in West Palm Beach, and lived what was, by reputation at least, a strikingly ordinary teenage life, defined more by golf and video games than by politics, with a famously reserved personality that reportedly made him something of a mystery even to people who had actually met him. That changed quickly once he turned 18. He graduated from Oxbridge Academy in May of 2024, and just months later, an assassination attempt targeting his father pulled the entire family into a far more intense spotlight than they had previously faced. That fall, Barron enrolled at NYU's Stern School of Business, and photographs of him walking to class flanked by Secret Service agents spread quickly online, reportedly making him one of the most photographed college freshmen in the country without him ever sitting for a single on-camera interview. That November, he cast his first vote ever for his own father in Florida. By January of 2025, he was standing at his father's second inauguration, visibly taller than the rest of his family, a detail striking enough that searches about his height reportedly spiked online that same day. His father even acknowledged him from the podium, crediting him with pushing the campaign toward exactly the kind of podcast-heavy media strategy, including a notable appearance on Joe Rogan's show, that reportedly helped win over younger male voters. According to some reports, Barron did not return to NYU's Manhattan campus the following fall, instead taking classes at the university's Washington, D.C. location while living at the White House. He made rare public appearances at Thanksgiving and New Year's at Mar-a-Lago during the 2025 holidays, both described at the time as among his first real public appearances in nearly a year. That's the baseline here, a young man whose entire public identity for almost 2 decades was built on simply not being visible, which makes it all the more notable that Ansari's letter now describes him as someone allegedly influential within his father's orbit, a characterization that remains an allegation, not a confirmed fact. And this pattern of unexpected visibility isn't limited to the Tate story or the BBC case. One outlet tracking coverage of Barron reportedly counted more than 60 separate stories published about him in just the past 3 months alone, a dramatic shift for someone who spent nearly 2 decades actively avoiding cameras. Earlier this summer, Barron reportedly skipped his older brother Donald Trump Jr.'s wedding entirely, and his absence from every photo released from the event fueled speculation about tension within the family that nobody has addressed publicly. At the 2026 FIFA World Cup final, cameras caught him relaxed backstage alongside FIFA's president during an awkward trophy presentation moment where his father faced audible booing from the crowd, a small moment, but one that shows how even when Barron isn't trying to make news, cameras tend to find him anyway. Layer all of that on top of a sitting member of Congress now using words like influential and accountable in the same sentence as his name, and you get a portrait of a young man experiencing a genuinely dramatic reversal after years of being the one family member deliberately kept out of frame. So where does this actually go from here? The honest answer is that, right now, very little of this is settled. Barron Trump has not been charged with any crime. He has not been formally subpoenaed. There remains no public evidence that he influenced any actual government decision involving the Tate brothers' prosecution or extradition. Ansari's letter is exactly that, a letter, currently sitting with a Republican chairman who has no obligation to act on it. But the timing is worth watching closely. Midterm elections are approaching in November of 2026, and if control of the House shifts, so does control over which investigations actually move forward and who holds subpoena power. Multiple reports suggest Democrats may be treating this as a card worth holding rather than playing immediately, meaning this story could shift very quickly depending on how those elections play out. There's also a broader point buried in all of this that goes beyond just one family. When a lawsuit or a congressional letter gets filed, it rarely stays contained to the person named at the very top of the document. Discovery requests, subpoena powers, formal investigations, once triggered, these tools have a way of reaching toward the people standing closest to the center of power, whether or not those people ever expected to be pulled into the story. Family members, advisors, even, apparently, the one son who spent his entire life trying to stay completely out of frame. Whether Barron Trump ever actually testifies about any of this, or whether the entire request quietly fades the way so many congressional letters eventually do, one thing already seems clear. The version of his life, defined almost entirely by silence and privacy, is being tested in a way it never was before. The BBC case keeps grinding forward toward a trial now expected in early 2027, with a fight over financial records still unresolved even after a temporary court-ordered pause. The congressional letter sits waiting on a desk that may or may not ever act on it. Both stories are still very much unfinished, and both are worth watching closely as they develop, because for a family that spent years controlling exactly what the public got to see, that level of control now looks more uncertain than it has in a long time. If you want to stay caught up as both of these stories continue to develop, let us know your thoughts in the comments and stick around, because there's a lot still unfolding here that's worth tracking closely.